This podcast is a production of Unfiltered Studios. If you would like to know more about joining Unfiltered Studios, please visit our website at unfpod.com for more information.
And now, here's a word from our sponsor.
Spartacus Coffee is made for and made by hustlers, entrepreneurs, peak athletes, self-starters, and free thinkers. Our community of coffee drinkers believe in lifting each other up to be the best version of ourselves we can be. On top of that, every sale goes to the nonprofit organization No Kid Hungry, a national effort to end childhood hunger in America. To learn more about that and order some of the best, richest coffee you can find at an affordable price, go to SpartacusCoffee.com and be sure to use my promo code. It's pretty simple. It's JBurke, which is JAYBURKE, and get 10% off your first order. Remember, Spartacus Coffee. We fuel the grind, we fuel the success, we fuel champions. We are Spartacus.
And now back to your regularly scheduled program.
Just to put a little disclaimer out there, we're living in politically volatile times. This episode was recorded a few months ago, and in light of the recent assassination attempt on the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, I considered postponing its release. However, I do believe this episode is crucial, offering a high-level view of the current political climate. The discussion is conducted tastefully, covering a wide range of topics. Ben, our guest, is actively engaging on the ground with voters of all stripes, understanding their concerns. So I feel like this episode is essential for this show and is divided into two parts. And my hope is that listeners will appreciate its concern for this dangerous political moment.
We're going to give riot warnings. We're going to try to get compliance, but this is now effectively a riot.
49 hours declaring it a riot.
The scene of January 6th, 2021 was one of unprecedented chaos and intensity. The usually serene Capitol grounds were transformed into a battlefield of clashing ideologies. American flags and Trump banners danced in the cold January wind, mingling with the chants and shouts echoing below them. As the crowd surged forward, barriers erected by Capitol Police buckled under the pressure. The officers, overwhelmed and outnumbered, were powerless to contain the swelling mass pushing against them. Tear gas and flashbangs erupted sporadically, adding to the confusion and sense of urgency. Protesters, some clad in military-style gear, others in everyday clothing, pushed their way up the steps of the Capitol, breaching the doors and smashing in windows. Just a few short years before, Ben Hamilton was a high school history teacher. As the chaos swirled around him in every which direction he turned, I have to think the question, "How the hell did I end up here?" must have echoed in his mind. But this was not a random twist of fate. It was a deliberate choice. Ben had left the classroom for the front lines of history, driven by a desire to witness and document these seismic events firsthand. And now that he was navigating the frenzied crowd, the weight of history was pressing down on him. The iconic rotunda, once a symbol of American democracy, now stood as a backdrop to a deeper, more enduring force within the American psyche. One that had been brewing for years, maybe decades, or perhaps since the nation's inception. That strange vibe of a country unsettled, or maybe never settled. See, we've been a land that talks about its blessings, but never really counted them. Who fought for rights from the British only to struggle over who should enjoy those rights. From the bitter divisions of our earliest elections to industrial strife, the Civil War, waves of immigration, women's suffrage, debates over our part in the world wars and how the world should be shaped afterwards, the civil rights movement, the anti-war protests of the 60s and 70s, the backdrop of communism, gay rights, abortion rights. We are a mosaic of divergent values, religions, and classes spread across vast lands. All of us are bound together by a daring idea inscribed on parchment 248 years ago. And through every challenge, we've been striving to hold this grand experiment together. And for everybody watching on that day, I think we all wondered, was this the moment it all would fall apart? And through it all, Ben Hamilton stood resolute, documenting a nation at its most desperate, grasping for a peek in its past that might have never truly existed. See, in that moment, Ben transformed into the figures he admired, the Hunter S. Thompsons and Jack Kerouacs of the world. In this moment, Ben was something more. He became the teacher turned witness.
We lost the line! We lost the line! All MPDs get back! All MPDs get back up to the upper deck! All MPDs get back to the upper deck!
But find out for yourself in an episode I'm calling The Teacher Turned Witness. Ben Hamilton's eyewitness account of January 6th. It won't always be a straight line.
It won't always be a straight line.
It won't always be a straight line.
But take the journey.
Take the journey.
Take the journey.
Escape a while for thoughtful excursions
Into the world of ideas across media,
politics, technology,
Pop culture.
and all realms of civic life. Take the journey.
Take the journey.
Take the journey.
Take the journey. Take the journey.
Take the journey.
You're listening to The With Jay Burke Show. Hello and welcome to The With Jay Burke Show. My name is Jason Burke, and though I'm technically the host of this podcast, it's the guests who truly take top billing. This is a place for curious minds who enjoy civil and sometimes meandering conversation. If you appreciate a few laughs and want to come away with new knowledge about subjects that aren't always easy to break down, then you're the person I want listening to this podcast. In today's episode, we dive into the captivating journey of Ben Hamilton, a figure who transitioned from a tranquility of the classroom to, well, that's funny, from the tranquility of the classroom to the epicenter of contemporary history. Once a dedicated history teacher, Ben has transformed into a daring adventurer, seeking to document the pivotal moments shaping our era. His fearless pursuit of truth has led him from engaging with the voices on the bustling streets of Washington, D.C. during the January 6th Capitol riot to reflecting on his firsthand experiences in his compelling work, Sorry Guys, We Stormed the Capitol. With a foundation in political science and enriched by direct political involvement, Ben offers an insightful perspective on the complexities of our time, making him a unique and captivating guest to this show. Ben, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for your kind words. I'm not sure I'm quite that amazing, but I appreciate your vote of confidence.
Well, compared to me, everybody's just like, everybody's a step up, I think. So, but I was really excited to do this one because, the show, it actually looks at a lot of things from historical context. We like looking at things from where they started or how they got there, or trying to put the web together, if that makes sense. And I think a lot of history is that, at least the nuance in it is like that.
Yeah, that's definitely, that's what I love.
And that's what I like about your work, because I could tell, it's more like a firsthand perspective of everything rather than just the media narrative or something like that. It's just like a person's journey and experience. It's like you're there with you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I'm going for. My goal in the Chasing History project is to try and witness historical events as much as I can and interview people who witnessed the ones I missed, so that, 100 years from now, should I be lucky enough that someone somewhere reads my book, they'll feel like they know what it felt like to live through these times. So many times history is just this collection of facts and events. It's almost like a plot you're being read. And people forget that, like, at any given moment in real life, when these things were happening, it could have gone another way. We talk about like the 60s or World War II or whatever, all these social movements, and we have this like one sentence summary of them, if that, in our head, saying, oh, that's when that happened. But that's not how it felt like to the people living through it. The people living through it, like, anything could have happened. And like, this is just the way it happened to roll out. And that's what I try to capture in my books. I have the one about January 6th, which I should circle back to explain how I managed to be there, because I'm always get asked that. And then the other one that's coming out hopefully in a few months was about shortly before that, when the protesters took over part of Seattle, if you remember that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I managed to get in the middle of that too. And in both of them, that's my goal, is to make, it's maybe self-congratulatory to compare yourself to other authors, especially when they're successful and you're not. But I love Hunter Thompson. Hunter Thompson, because he pioneered the idea that, like, his feelings, his experience, is part of the story. Like he goes to these events and he's just like these, especially when he covered politics, like just the revulsion and the disgust he feels when he meets politicians becomes something that he spends pages and pages talking about. It's not just a news report. It's like you feel like, oh, you're there. You can feel it. And that's always been a big influence on me. I do think that is part of the role of a good author. I think you have to be accurate. I think the great unforgivable sin when recording any sort of nonfiction event is to say something, to deliberately omit something that you know is important, that you know would influence the way people view an event. And you must never, never do those things. That's your number one priority. But after that, you also want it to be interesting. And I think making people feel the emotions, the fear, the excitement that you felt at that moment makes it interesting and makes them want to read it more in the first place.
I totally agree. So I studied journalism for a while, and I wanted to get into that. I loved writing, and I loved, actually, specifically, I did love Hunter S. Thompson. And, I love Taibbi's kind of like from the same cloth, too, in a way. Just his descriptiveness.
He's better in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I would say the pure skill of throwing out a really beautiful sentence, I would still give it to Hunter, but Taibbi does his homework. Taibbi's like somebody who read Hunter and loved it and said, what if I applied this, but actually researched it more carefully? Because for all his flaws, Hunter's not as accurate as Taibbi.
That's true. The way Taibbi covered the 2008 financial crisis, I mean, nobody did.
The vampire squid.
That's one of my favorite lines. Yeah. Was it? It's J.P. Morgan is like a vampire squid on the face of humanity. What was it? Relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. Something like that.
Yes, something like, but like that's why Taibbi's brilliant, and that's exactly what I'm talking about, because that's not a lie. That was totally accurate what he said, but he found a very interesting way to say it, and that helped people remember it and want to read it more. And I'm very inspired by that tradition of nonfiction authors.
Yeah, well, I think it's important what you're saying, right? Because, listen, I hear this all the time, and people talk about how I wish news was just down the middle and straight with me, but there's a reason why you don't see that anymore, and you don't see that on the networks, and you don't read it in newspapers, because people really tune out. They don't give a shit because it's boring. And, he had a way of making it interesting. There's other guys out there, too, who kind of try to do that now. That's part of the new journalism school. That's Hunter probably started that. I mean, I think it ultimately killed him, but
yeah, I think Hunter made some decisions early in his life that he was not able to undo in the last 10 or 15 years, even if the logical outcome of it was painful. Like, he sort of devoted himself to this writing, this religion of the creator. Yeah. Of being a creator, not like a religious creator. Like,
he dedicated his life to the god of writing, and then
well, it just he had. I feel like it's funny, I've never really talked about this before, but like Hunter was alive when I was a kid. I was very upset when he killed himself. And I used to watch interviews by him and read articles that he'd written and things about him, all the little details of his life. And I got a sense that maybe I'm wrong, but like his philosophy was something that like the writing was the meat.
Yeah.
And find maybe even the truth, searching for the American dream, as he used to say. But like he got his start. He said he learned how to write a great book by writing great books that had already been written. He just sat down at his typewriter and retyped some of his favorite books, including the Book of Revelations. And then, like, having put himself in his mindset that, like, okay, this is the energy I'm channeling. He was playing with some powerful, sometimes dark forces. He then wrote himself into his stories. He became a character in his books. There was a character named Hunter S. Thompson, and that wasn't quite the same person as the person named Hunter S. Thompson. And he said that, like, at some point he couldn't remember anymore where the difference was. He couldn't remember who the real original him was and who the creation that was a character in his book was. And that drove him mad, I think, which is worth noting because I did the same goddamn thing.
Well, yeah, I
accept the consequences.
I want to get to you on that, but it's funny you said that because I remember reading that he used to read, I think, The Great Gatsby out loud, and he would retype that one too. And yeah, you're probably right. He did become, like, I remember hearing, like, towards the end, he was almost like a caricature of himself at some point. Like they based some kind of comic on him.
Oh, yeah. In the Doonesbury comics, the character of Duke is based on Hunter Thompson,
and they said that's pretty much like Hunter at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. If you read, it's funny. I was a big fan of Doonesbury. Like I had like the collected books I used to read. Not many people were that into it. But if you read the very first appearance of that character, he's just straight up Hunter S. Thompson. He works at Rolling Stone. He looks exactly like him. He's always on drugs. The longer the story went on, the more the character diverged.
Yeah. I always, and I swear I'm going to get to you, but I always heard he also made it like his mission to take Nixon down. And once Nixon went down, he almost had like, I don't want to say nothing to live for, but that was his moment, right? Like he took out Nixon. Like I think he laid on the grass at the Capitol somewhere, that area in DC, and just, like soaked it in.
Yeah, I think it is definitely fair to say that he peaked at some point, and after that he was past his prime, and he was haunted by that like he used to do all this really great work, and now he's doing, it was fine, but like he wasn't as excited, he didn't have that passion anymore. At some point he used himself up. And sometimes it's kind of like a rock star. Sometimes they do that. Is that same sort of life.
So, but let's get to you, because that's what we're here for. I didn't expect to go into Hunter, so that was cool. So you were obviously a history teacher. You said you were inspired somewhat by Hunter S. Thompson. So how long were you a teacher, and what was the moment that you're like, you know what, I'm going to go do this other thing that I've always wanted to do?
Well, I was a teacher for, depending on how you want to count it, somewhere between 5 and 10 years. I have a lot of different teaching experiences. I taught English as a second language in Saudi Arabia for a while. I've taught multiple age groups. The really thing that I loved most was teaching high school history, high school social studies too. I only did that, not as long as I would have liked, just a few years, 3-4 years in there. And then the pandemic hit. And so I was in a situation where my particular contract, I had been working a 1-year contract already. And so I didn't get any of that good pandemic money. And so it kind of occurred to me like, this is the best moment I'm ever going to get to circle back to my original dream of being a writer. Because what you got to understand about me, like the extent that even I understand me, it's confusing, is I always had this urge to be one of the great adventurer writers. You know, we talked about Hunter S. Thompson. There's a few other people I'd put on that list. Jack Kerouac obviously springs to mind. John Steinbeck specifically with Travels with Charlie. These people who wrote nonfiction adventures and became the character in the story. And then, you know, they had these wild adventures and wrote them down and turned them into art. I'd always wanted to be one of those guys ever since I was, you know, mid-teens, you know, and I had a lot of wild adventures in like my late teens and early 20s, just hitchhiking across multiple continents, you know, doing all kinds of sex and drugs and things like that. And I had this vague idea that at some point that was going to turn into a book. Yeah. And I tried to, you know, I had like a stack of books that I'd wrote to just never finish the editing process, that I just never published. Maybe someday I will. Those were kind of like my answer to Jack Kerouac.
Yeah. And
then like after doing all those things, I kind of settled down to try and like pretend I was a mild-mannered high school teacher. I also often felt like a fraud. Like, you know,
I understand that. Yeah.
I'm sitting here watching study hall, making sure the kids behave. If the parents knew half the shit I've done before I got this job, you know?
Yeah. You're like a figure of authority who always fought against authority at that point.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah. You know, so I remember one little, here's a little history teacher moment. I love mixing these in. Karl Marx had a teacher like that. Like he had a history teacher who taught like very subversive ideas and got in trouble and got fired. You know, and by the way, I'm not a Marxist. I don't really think it works well, but you got to admire the structure of people criticizing the way things are and rebelling against them. I cannot help but admire that. I set myself up by bringing up Marx, but, you know, like it's very easy to criticize the Marxists and the communists, but Karl Marx was never the ruler of any country. He was a writer. He put these ideas out there that maybe this would work. And when people tried them, they didn't work as well as he hoped.
Well, I would also throw in there, and I'm not a Marxist either. Mm-hmm. Everybody who's tried them skipped a few steps from what Marx did, right? And they just became more authoritarian. I mean, there's nothing authoritarian really about him. So I argue that with like capitalism too. You can look at Adam Smith, right? Like, I mean, fought against monopolies. You know, back then they had the what's it called, the East India trading company, tea company. What the hell's the name?
There were a lot of them. Yeah, the East India company.
They were like,
because they had like a monopoly on 50% of the world trade, and it even had its own private army. So he would take the side of the consumer over the producer, the worker over the factory owner, and he was really suspicious of like mercantile capitalism, or, you know, like the traders and the manufacturers and stuff.
If you actually read his writings, you know, he uses invisible hand like once, and it has nothing to do with the invisible hand of the market. He's just basically talking about he's just talking about free hand from monopolies and why they shouldn't exist. But so it's funny, like everything gets bastardized at some point. But I think they're all fascinating to read. Like it's really just like a study of how we get to this point, you know? Like,
yeah, I would agree.
I think it's all fascinating. It's all kind of like just philosophy, honestly, more than an economic.
Yeah. Although Marx is interesting because he felt philosophy was kind of a waste of time unless you had a specific call to action.
Right.
So he wanted people to do something. But he's also a historian. So, like, I think what he does well is criticize capitalism. I think capitalism needed criticizing. This is a guy living in Europe, you know, with the Industrial Revolution, with little, you know, 8-year-old kids with black lung working in the coal mines and smokestacks from the factories that have just sprung up. There's people who can remember when there were no factories still. And now the factories are everywhere and you keep blotting out the sun. And he's like, well, this is bullshit. Someone needs to call bullshit on this. That was a valid thing to do. I just think it ended up getting, I want to overthrow the government and seize power. People like Marxism, I'll say I'm a Marxist. Yeah. They just kind of slapped that on top of it.
It's a buzzword for like anybody. I just find most people who follow those kind of thought processes either have never read Marx. It's the same thing the other way around. And like, that's the kind of thing that education should be for.
like at minimum your freshman year of college. Honestly, you could read these things in high school. You sit down, you just read Marx, read Adam Smith, get the different viewpoints, talk about what they were right about, talk about what they were wrong about. That's the role of education. And it doesn't happen at all anymore. That was another reason that I decided to set out and start the Chasing History Project. Because you way back to the prompt before I derailed the conversation, you were asking how I set out to do this. And that was kind of the lightning that connected it. The idea that I could take these ideas I had about recording history and the kinds of records I wanted people to have. As a history teacher, the word that was really important was primary source historical document. Documents that were actually witnessed by the people who were studying, as opposed to, hundreds of years later. And then combine that with my idea previously of wanting to be an adventure author. And I was like, what if I do both? What if I set out to put myself deliberately in situations where I think something significant might happen and throw myself into the danger? And if I survive, I get a book about it, and I'll just see how many of those I can get through. I'm through 2 now. I've climbed down the walls of the Capitol building to escape police tear gas. I escaped a gunfight. I got my face kicked in. I had got nerve damage. It hurts every second of every day. It hurts right now. Yeah. But I got 2 books out of it, and we'll see how long until it kills me. But that's the idea of the Chasing History Project, is to try and put somebody there to see those things and take people along with you. Now, I want to talk a little bit before I forget about method, because setting out to witness history, it sounds like a difficult task, but it's funny. I found out that it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be, guessing where something interesting would happen and putting myself there. I found that the thing that grabs something on my radar is if news coverage of large events contradict each other. So if I can put on one TV station and say, they're flipping over cars, there's fire everywhere, there's firearms, it's a coup, it's a whatever, which, by the way, people said about both the thing in Seattle and January 6th. And then I turn on another station. I'm like, and the other station's like, no, it's a mostly peaceful protest. Peaceful protest. Those people are crazy. That's my clue. When I see that happening in the news coverage, I'm like, I'm going to go there. I'm just going to stand there and I'm going to interview people until someone tells me something interesting. And it works pretty well. Like it got me to the thing in Seattle. It lasted like 3 weeks. Yeah. So I was there to be more than about the last week of it, a little more than the last week, a little less than half. It was already ongoing. So I just showed up and I just started interviewing people to try and set the record straight, find out what was really happening, because I wanted to know. I heard these conflicting reports. And then the other one, I noticed there were conflicting reports about the MAGA rallies for Donald Trump's reelection. Some of the reports were claiming there were like Nazi flags and people being beaten all the time. And other people were saying it was the last hope of the Jedi to defeat the Dark Lord and the Sith. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to follow around MAGA rallies. So that's how I ended up doing my January 6th book. I didn't specifically know January 6th would happen. Right. But I was following Trump events. I moved into a van, which honestly I love. It's a very simple lifestyle. And I was like a groupie for like a band. Like I just drove from event, city to city. Every couple of days, I'd go to another Trump event. And I was just interviewing people in the crowds, taking notes, seeing what sort of interesting story developed. I had a rough image in my head of doing like a compilation of different discussions I had, but after not that long of doing that, a month or so, January 6th happened. And I was already in the crowd interviewing people. So I was like, well, obviously this is the book. Obviously this is what people want to read. And so I ended up just publishing all of the notes, well, not all, but I ended up publishing a narrative of my day on January 6th, just from morning to evening, the whole day, more or less in order. And that's what the book is. But I had, enough for 2 or 3 other books, just because I had all these notes about other MAGA rallies. So I often get asked by people, well, how did you know that was going to happen? Seems very suspicious you'd be there. That's how. Okay. That's what I was doing. And so I've managed to thoroughly bury the lead, as I always do. But people are probably curious about January 6th. So if you want to specifically talk about what I saw that day, I'd be happy to get into that.
Well, let me ask you this, because obviously you're following this around. That's a tumultuous time. You know, you have COVID became extremely politicized and used as a weapon, wherever you fall on it. I mean, it's used as a weapon by each side.
I would agree with that. I would also say that it's not clear, at least in my mind, who even weaponized it first.
I would actually agree with that too.
I think there's a lot of people, and I get very sick of this. I try to say this earlier in interviews usually. I'm just so sick of political narratives. I'm sick of like people. Look, in order to understand events, we often have to make a story in our minds to understand it. That makes sense. But if there's just one narrative, your team, your political team, about how they're right and everything bad is the result of the other side, and you just try to fit everything you see into that pre-existing narrative, then you're never going to find the truth. Not only that, you'll probably prevent other people from doing it too. I think it's genuinely harmful. Yes. So I get really sick of people who make up their mind before they hear anything and who turn everything into this massive one single argument, my side better than your side, as opposed to looking at things issue by issue.
So you sound a lot like me because I talk about, I consider I'm an independent. And I look at, I mean, I'm kind of all over the place, right? Because I look at things issue to issue and I look at, you know, what society needs. And first of all, I think it's ridiculous. I grew up, and I always say this, I grew up in an extremely conservative household. So when I was younger, I kind of espoused to that kind of stuff. But I was always a thinker, you know, and I was always a guy who questioned things. And
that's fascinating. You know what I can say? I find that funny. I grew up in a very liberal household, but I was always a thinker and I always questioned things. And it's funny that we kind of met in the middle.
Somewhere. Yeah. You know, it's funny though, people who listen to this, like depending on the side they are like, you're not an independent, you're, you're a Marxist or you're you're the Reaganite or something. Who the hell knows? But yeah, you know what, one thing I always found too is like, even if I had an opinion on something, when somebody would tell me theirs, I always found the easiest thing I could do was ask them why. Why do you think that?
Yeah.
And if you keep they can poke holes in their own arguments. Even if it's something you agree with, you're like, they didn't think this through. You know, they just heard this somewhere. And a lot of people do that because it's a lot of work to try to figure it all out.
That's my man Socrates right there.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people say, you know, the foundation of all Western thought is just a guy who just kept asking that question. And if people they get offended and upset that you ask them why they believe something, that's a red flag.
I agree.
That's a sign that maybe this person should not be thinking for you. Maybe you should not be surrendering, control of your opinions over to just agreeing with whatever they happen to say.
Yeah. I think it's just it's easy though. The way the media narrative, it's just so funny to me in such a big country with so many people that two opinions reign over everything, right? And
yeah,
that's what I always thought was funny too. It's we can't do one thing forever because things change, you have to go with the times. I don't know. I always thought it was kind of funky when somebody just was like, oh, I'm this or I'm that. I'm like, well, it doesn't make sense to me because now you're married to something that can't last forever. Everything's got to change and move in some forward fashion.
Yeah, that's where a lot of the danger comes from, is a lot of people attach their sense of identity to a set of opinions. And if you're going to attach your sense of identity to anything, at least it should just be the process by which you came to those opinions,
right?
Reason, logic. If I'm going to attach my identity to something, it will be the way I try to interrogate the facts to come up with the truth and see things for myself. But when I uncover new information, it often results in me changing my mind, and I'm stunned how many friends I lose every time I do that. How many people who they're like, oh, I thought you were on our team. I've often said that one of my proudest accomplishments is if you look at the Amazon reviews on my book, I'm hated by both liberals and conservatives.
Yeah, that means you're doing something right.
Yeah, that's my point. That's what you should shoot for. Although it gets really annoying reading reviews of people who obviously didn't read the book. That's here's I sense this book might be against my worldview. I'm going to make the world a better place. I'm going to go into battle by writing a fake review about a book I didn't read because I'm proud of that, because I'm guessing maybe if I did read it, I wouldn't like it. And I just, oh God, it annoys me so much when people do that. Like it really does. I know it shouldn't. It'll probably be the death.
No, I mean, but somebody is like trashing your book without giving it a fair shot. Like it's one thing if they read it and they're like, this is garbage and I don't believe, right? You could respect it maybe. It might sting, but like, it's like, all right, you probably, at least you tried.
Yeah. Like people will write on my books, hoax, there was no January 6th, or we have videos, nothing happened, which, I'm jumping around here a little bit, but one of the key things I think I took from watching January 6th, and especially from interviewing so many other people about what they saw, is different things happened in different places and in different times. Like, I just, for context, once I realized what was happening, I ran towards the building. Dumb thing to do, should run away, but I ran to interview people. And there was a point where like the crowd just started surging forward through a broken window, and like lots of people were going into the building. And I was like seconds away from being drawn into the building. The last minute I decided, nope, I jumped aside and people went past me. So that's as far as I got. But what I decided to do is stand outside the building and interview people as they left and ask them what they did inside. So I have several interviews in a row like that. And those interviews, they don't match each other. I've
heard some of them. I was listening to some.
Yeah. Oh,
fascinating.
Oh, yeah. They're all on my website. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Anybody interested, they're in every interview I used in the book is posted in full on the website at chasinghistoryproject.com. I had to make a few cuts occasionally to just make things interesting. It was painstaking because I feel like people shouldn't cut history, but I did. But so no one can accuse me of bias. Anyone who wants to hear the full interviews can hear them on the website. But so one guy, he was very insistent that they were playing football, was how he described it. He was almost like he was comforting people. It was like, nobody was getting punched, nobody was getting kicked. We just pushed the police down the hallway. Which, that doesn't count, like we were playing football in there. But then I talked to a guy a couple minutes later who's like, oh, I was punching, I was kicking, so the first guy really believed no one had been getting punched, but the other guy just punched someone at some other place,
right?
At some other time. You can't just assume that what you did is what everyone else did. And I think a lot of people make that mistake to this day. And there was another guy who said, yeah, it was totally quiet. I just walked in, looked at the statues and walked out. I didn't see anybody.
I wondered that. I felt bad for some people because I was thinking, I wonder if I'm there and I'm just not I'm not a participant.
Mm-hmm.
If I just want to run in there and see what's going on. I just want to see it. And then next thing you know, I'm there. I'm an insurrectionist.
Yeah, no, I was extremely tempted to go in myself. I was very curious, especially as a guy who was specifically there to write about whatever interesting thing happened. Right. Sometimes I still second guess myself. But I had to do a very quick cost-benefit analysis, risk-benefit analysis of what point it stopped being worthwhile. I remember that you described me earlier as fearless. That's not true. I'm afraid of a lot of things. I do some shit that I'm afraid of, but I also turn around and run at a certain point.
Yeah.
When I was in the thing in Seattle at the Chop, there were people started shooting guns around me, screaming, "I'm fucking running!" I was scared out of my mind. I went back the next day.
Yeah. Can I back up on some? Because sure. I started and then I went off, but I always promise meandering conversation. So I set everybody up,
Yeah. That's why this is a fun art form. It's the only one where you have permission to do that.
Right.
There's an audience expectation that maybe they're going to meander for several hours. You can't do that in any other format. You have to have a more clear point. But in podcasts, you get to do the tangents.
Exactly. I always say that, you could almost be get away with being sloppy sometimes. You know what I mean? Like making mistakes, and because it's like sitting in someone's house and just listening to a couple of people talk. It's kind of cool that way. But originally, I had started saying, obviously, you said you were like a roadie, or I'm sorry, a groupie almost for these events that Trump was doing, and then he started with, it was a strange time. COVID, you got a very, very heated election cycle. You got a lot of things. You just got a lot of things in the pot stewing. Looking back, do you see a momentum building to January 6th, or is it just like still a shocker that happened?
Yes, I absolutely do. I thought it was just pressure. I did not specifically know that day was going to be when something wild happened, but I suspected some sort of eruption of all the built up pressure might come sometime around the election. And to be frank, I'm expecting kind of the same thing at the end of this year, when there is another presidential election. I definitely had a sense of rising tension, rising urgency. For me, it was all kind of one event, because first you had the lockdown, I think would be arguably a good place to begin it.
Right.
And so if there's something I had a section of my book about that. Here we go. Do you mind if I read from a section from my book?
Not at all.
So I saw the events surrounding the lockdown as like the pivotal setup that allowed January 6th to happen later. And so this is a section of the book when I'm describing that time period. A year before the crowd from Trump's speech swarmed the Capitol building, my civilization was dealt a crippling blow by the COVID-19 pandemic, aka coronavirus. From March to May 2020, state governments ordered lockdowns to fight the spread of the disease. Suddenly, it seemed every school, small business, and public space in America was closed, citation included. Without a functioning economy, unemployment and poverty skyrocketed. Within 3 months, both were growing at the fastest rates since the Great Depression, citations listed. I remember passing rows of rotting storefronts, every inch of their sidewalks overflowing with dirt-smeared homeless tents. Everything solid was falling apart. Even those of us who didn't get sick or get sucked into poverty were prisoners in our own homes during the lockdown. There were no bars, no movie theaters, no sports, no concerts, no public entertainment of any kind. If we left the house to buy food, we had to wear medical masks. No one had a face anymore. No one could smile at you. We were a giant, soulless blob with 1,000 vacant eyes. Our entire population was cut off from everything that gave us joy, and everyone around me to succumb to insanity. They spent all their time bragging about arguments they'd won on the internet with people they had never met. So I kind of argue that like people had already sort of gone stir crazy after being stuck inside for so long. And then that section goes on to make the point, I kind of trace the line with that like sense of desperation. You had the George Floyd protests, and suddenly there was something they were allowed to do. The first thing they were allowed to go outside to do was to go vent their anger for a political cause. And then the MAGA rallies. For some reason, those were the only two things people were allowed to do. They were stuck at home, stirring in their anger. The only things they could go do would go George Floyd protests and MAGA rallies. That was like a couple of years. And that I see was the pressure that finally broke in January 6th. That was the final result of that.
Yeah, it's funny you said George Floyd, because that's what I was thinking of too. It's like, that, I mean, I think it gets national attention probably, but the reaction to it probably wouldn't have been the same because, you had people just sitting at home. They're scared. Nobody knows what the future is. Nobody knows what to think about.
Right. And now they have someone to blame.
They have an outlet.
Who do we blame? It's the police.
Yeah.
It's their fault, which again, not to say that all police are good. Obviously, police brutality is a real thing. But there was a kind of desperate energy at that time that people were channeling in like anti-police rallies at the George Floyd rallies. That's what I wrote about when I was in my upcoming book about the history on the chop. In Seattle, the anti-police protests, it used to be people would show up to a protest, they'd go home, and then they'd go to class the next day, go back to college. But now you had this group of people that had nowhere to go. So the next day they just kept coming back. So the protest, it just had no logical reason to end because everything else in the country was shut down. So just day after day, week after week, the crowd would show up and they'd chant and things would get more tense between them and the police. And because it repeated day after day was why it was able to become so extreme.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's just, it's hard to believe like that's sort of past us, I guess. Like COVID's not really a thing anymore. I mean, it's still around, but it's just, the fear that was out there at that time was just, different. And so
it definitely depends on who you're talking to. There's some people who are just like not willing to give up the habits that they established back then. Like, I'm only speculating here, but I got the sense, like I remember one time during the COVID, I was in the shoe store and I scratched my nose. So that involved like moving my mask down slightly to scratch my nose. And the other customer sitting next to me, just not even like any sort of official capacity, just a guy shopping there started like yelling at me, just screaming at me, like, put your mask back up. I think there were people like that who kind of got off on the power of like just telling other people what to do.
Yeah.
And I think they haven't really come to terms with not being allowed to do that anymore, or God forbid, admitting that maybe they'd been a jerk. I think there's people who are like 3 or 4 years removed of that, and they're just refusing to be like, nope, I didn't overreact. You're underreacting. And they're just not like giving a single inch on that.
Yeah.
I think like if they got the go ahead to like, okay, start yelling at everyone, making them put on masks again, they would in a heartbeat.
Yeah. I mean, I think that kind of worked in 2 ways too. Like the mask became just like the symbol, right? Like for some reason it became like, it became such a rights issue, right? So I remember I didn't care. I wore the mask. I mean, it's like piece of cloth on my face, something on my face, right?
Yeah, I mean,
like, I didn't really give a shit.
My feeling. I felt like I saw it as it became being polite. Like if there's other people who are upset that I'm not doing it, fine, just to calm them down. But that was when there was a lockdown.
Right.
Now, like if I go to a business and the business owner asks me to put on a mask, I will. That's his call to make.
Right.
Or maybe I just won't shop there. If I go to the doctor's office and that's office policy to put on a mask, that's their call to make. But if I go to the business and the business owner hasn't said anything and some other customer is getting in my face and telling me to wear a mask, that person's an asshole. It's kind of the way I define it.
So I'm sort of the same way with that. Like I don't know. It just didn't affect me that much to do that. Like you said, I probably viewed it in the sense of like, it's just a polite thing to do.
Although I will say one thing I found fascinating, again, steering back to January 6th anecdote, is everybody there, they had bandanas. Bandanas were the popular thing I found amongst most Trump crowds because it was the least like a mask.
Right.
Like, so if somebody says you have to wear a mask in here, they'd begrudgingly pull it up. And again, like I totally get why they would find it annoying. But the point was they all had masks, but nobody would even pull them up. Like when you're breaking in windows, which I saw some people do, and if you're climbing in through those broken windows, which I saw a lot of people do, I would think you just take the bandana to cover your face. Like, but they didn't even occur to them to do that, which I think is very telling.
Yeah.
I think is very telling. Like, I think it's okay. Let me look at one of the main points that I always want to stress is that this is clearly a crime. This is breaking and entering, trespassing while Congress and the vice president are in session. Like, you think you're allowed to break into a building that has the vice president in it? Do I really have to explain this? Like, of course that was a crime.
Right.
If anyone wants to argue that, it wasn't a crime, then I'm worried. I'm worried I'm not going to be able to reason with this person if they can't even agree to that. Now, if you want to say that it wasn't a coup, that I can definitely have a meaningful conversation about. Like the coverage of January 6th was very misleading on the left and the right. But the left, their misleading coverage of it was like as this coup, insurrection, an attempt to overthrow our government. I did not see that. And I interviewed a lot of people, and I didn't hear it from anyone else either. I don't buy that. If it was a coup, then it had no chance in hell of ever succeeding. I found it to be kind of pathetic. Like, I found these people to be kind of losers, to be honest. And it's like, it's embarrassing to say a bunch of losers chased you out of the Capitol building. If someone chased Congress out of the Capitol building, it's almost like more dignified to say they were a big threat. I didn't think they really were. Like, right. But again, like, it's really hard for me to thread that needle because everybody starts yelling at me. Everybody says either I'm on their side, which I'm not, that was a crime and they all deserve to be punished for it, or that I'm like, pushing the lie that it was insurrection, which I don't buy. Maybe there's certain lawyers who would argue that they said because some of them really did have a stated goal of preventing them from certifying the election results. That maybe there actually was an attempt to, quote, overthrow the government. But even if technically it was,
it's not coordinated. I know what you're saying. It wasn't it
didn't match the way the media narrative portrayed
it. So I kind of agree with you in the same sense. So I think they should be tried. Like, they should have been tried. I think they should have been arrested.
Right. And there were a couple of people who, like the militia guys.
Yes. So that's what
they were actually able to try them for treason. And that probably sounds fair to me. Like, I had some pretty long interviews with some militia people. Didn't make it in the book because it was the day before.
Right.
But like, I got a sense that they had some idea something might happen. Like, I don't have the proof myself to convict them, but it doesn't sound crazy to me that you might say that they had some kind of crazy plot that technically amounted to treason. But even then, they were lunatics. They were dumb. Like, it was never going to work. They got swatted down immediately. So the idea that this whole event was just some giant, horrible, terrifying insurrection, I didn't see that. Like, I was on the ground. That was not my takeaway.
Listening to some of your interviews, there was one guy in particular that you were talking to, and it was funny because he was just so off base. I kind of felt bad for a lot of these people, honestly, just how desperate they seemed to, like.
Right.
So,
and again, that goes back to what I was saying. Like these are people who were struggling to get the medicine for their kids and like food. Like their family business had been seized in the last year. Like tons of these people were facing serious poverty, and nobody fucking cared. Nobody gave a shit about these people. It's not surprising to me that they would snap.
Right.
Again, don't support what they did, but you should understand things. That's how you learn from history. You've got to understand what people were thinking.
I think there's a big mistake. Now, I'm very open about this. I would never vote for Trump. I think he's has fascistic tendencies, personally. You don't have to answer that, but like, that's my thing. I think, though, they paint him as the virus, and I think he's a symptom of something. Right.
God,
so
that's what people said to me when I was there.
Right. I think he's a symptom. And there's an interesting study. I have it here because I really want to do a podcast on it, that came out not too long ago that just kind of blew me away.
Actually, I had a section in my book. Do you mind if I read this?
Go ahead.
To what you were saying. So this is from towards the end of the day, after the police pushed everyone out of the building and Congress is reconvening. I ended up sitting across the street from the building, which I wasn't supposed to do because there was a curfew. But like with me and like the one other guy left in the whole city who hadn't left, and we're sitting right across the street watching the live feed of it on a phone. Our hearts go out to the family of the young woman who was killed, she says. That young woman was killed by the police, shouts the guy sitting next to me. They're acting like we killed her. It was the police that killed her. Anyone watching this who wasn't there is going to think the protesters killed a girl, and we didn't do that. I say nothing. Some senators say something about comparing the collapse of the Roman Republic to the American Republic. That's what I always say. I try to listen to what he says, but it's just rhetorical flourish. He doesn't seem to have any particular point he's trying to make. Do any of them? The guy with the phone and I start discussing the Roman Republic. Trump is Caesar, he says. That's what I keep saying, I gush. I've been saying that for years. He's going to lead us across the Rubicon, he says. I think he already crossed the Rubicon, I say. I think this is him getting assassinated. There's another pause, and he looks at me. All these politicians, he says slowly and evenly, they don't understand that they're paving the way for somebody so much worse than Trump. This movement isn't going to go away. I've already talked to people who say things crazy, like they want to overthrow the government. People who hadn't been saying that 3 years ago.
Yeah, that goes to that point, right? I mean, what I was going to get to was there was a study done by a guy. Well, it wasn't just him. There was a bunch of researchers, but the main guy was called Michael Bang Peterson, and they were researchers in Denmark and France. And what they wanted to study was understanding why people believe or share conspiracy theories. And originally what they thought they would find is what everybody else would, right? That if Americans were presented with stories that were false and they were conspiracies, it didn't matter what it was. People weren't going to fact check them. If they were about Bernie Sanders or Ted Cruz or Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, they were going to share it if it was negative. And they would fall in a line between far-right Republicans and far-left Democrats. But what happened was that when they were doing the study, they found that there was a whole group of people that just shared anything that was conspiratorial. And it was so contrary to what they believed that they couldn't figure it out. And they interviewed them what they were thinking. And it was more people than you would think in the country who felt this way.
Well, I believe it. This is one of those things that I have like a stack of notes to write an entire book about. Like I met people who believe, I try not to use the term conspiracy theory because it's loaded, and
it is loaded.
Someone fact check me. Maybe you know this, but wasn't it literally coined by the CIA in order to discredit things that were true that they didn't want
probably
people to believe?
I don't know, but it sounds right.
Yeah. So like I got a lot of material on that until January 6th happened. I thought I was going to be writing a book. A lot of it was going to be about the adrenochrome story that a lot of people believed. Are you familiar with that?
Not really.
Okay.
Go into that.
So if you go to a Donald Trump event and you go to the line and you talk to people in the line, what you will see is a lot of people wearing homemade costumes, telling you that celebrities and politicians drink the blood of children in satanic rituals, and it keeps them young. Now, they will stress. I want to make sure I tell this story correctly. I don't want to misrepresent anyone. They will stress that the torture of the child means that it releases certain chemicals into their blood, and only when you do that, when you drink that blood, will it keep you young. Like they wouldn't think drinking any blood. It's the blood of a child while he was being tortured. That makes you young. And like I would talk to like these people, like they talk about it like on radio shows, like people who have radio shows or people who have millions of Twitter followers or at least hundreds of thousands will share things. Like there was one someone showed me like on their phone said, "Oh, hey, look at this celebrity. They look terrible. They didn't have their adrenochrome today." You know, this I don't know if the person who's sharing that really believed that, but the person reading it, showing it to me, seemed to genuinely believe that like missing their dose of tortured child blood, made them age rapidly. And like large amounts of people believed this, you know, and I would say like, you know, blood doesn't do that. You know, someone would know if blood did. You couldn't keep that a secret. You know, like I talked to people who believed that John McCain had actually been the head of Al Qaeda, and that when he died, he was secretly executed for treason by the United States. You know, I thought maybe there was a book here. Like these are different things people told me at Trump rallies. Like before January 6th, I thought maybe I'd read a book about that. So I've had thought about this a lot. There are people who like they research it. They're legit experts in this subject. I'm a guy who had a lot of face-to-face conversations about it, so I won't claim to have an all-encompassing knowledge, but I do have thoughts. And I think the first thing is that you got to understand that a lot of the news is bullshit.
Of course, yeah.
And a lot of stories get suppressed. Like, I'll tell you one that, like, I spent like 2 hours interviewing these guys. You know, it really caught me off guard. I'd heard several stories about the Satanists torturing the children. A lot of it comes back to do with children, and
yeah.
They said that Kevin Spacey had raped children, and when they accused him of it, he had them murdered. And they got me to Google it, and they were like, kind of right. Like, that one was actually sort of at least true. Like, he has been accused of having rape, underage sex. So if you have sex with a 15-year-old, even if it's consensual or not, it's rape. That's rape.
It is, yeah.
So he has been accused of that by like 3 or 4 different people, and everyone who's accused him of that dies suddenly shortly after being accused. Like, that's real, So there's often like a few of these things that they will point out that really are real, and where like the mainstream media is covering some up or glossing something over, or is just straight up full of shit. You know, like the one I often go back to, I mentioned it a little earlier, is Glenn Greenwald did some excellent research backing this up. I sourced it in the book. I didn't do any of the research myself. I just sourced it, but showing that the mob did not kill anyone on January 6th. People died. The police killed at least one person. So one person got shot. And there was like a police officer who had a stroke the next morning.
Right.
But the media desperately wanted to push the idea that the mob killed someone. There was a story that police officer was beaten over the head with a fire extinguisher. And this was like the goddamn New York Times. Like, the New York Times published a story saying the police was beaten over the head with a fire extinguisher. Sicknick was his name, and that he died from that. And that guy, his dead body was displayed in the Capitol building. It lay in state, the corpse of this guy. And members of Congress were told to walk past him because he was killed defending the Capitol, and he was not. That was a lie. And like the New York Times lied. They got it wrong, and they really resisted issuing a retraction. They never issued a full retraction. Like, a lot of news stories came around with the second try, and they said, okay, well, maybe he died of allergic reaction to the pepper spray that he was sprayed with that day. And they make a big deal out of the fact that there was a guy who sprayed him with pepper spray who was found guilty of spraying him with pepper spray. And then they'll mention in the article that, oh, he also died. And then they'll say as if he died of the pepper spray, but he didn't. It's not true. Like, he died of a stroke the day after. The coroner's report was very clear that it was natural causes. So here's my point, like that like these people who they find out that, oh, you could actually go back and check that these fucking stories were lies. Many of them were misleading. Some of them were straight up lies. The crowd didn't kill anyone. That news story was a lie. I wonder what else the news lies to me about. I think that kind of primes people to believe these other conspiracies. I think if the news had done a better job being credible, maybe they wouldn't have had such an easy time convincing people of conspiracies.
Well, that's very fair. I mean, the news now, it's partly just the profit incentive, the way it's set up now is that, I've talked to people who work for the news stations. A lot of times what I see and what I hear, and I say this a lot, like a lot of the people they show, or the types of things they talk about, and I'm mainly talking about the 24-hour news cycle, and I'm talking about all of them. It's very easy to back up your point. Like they were saying, like, I could say something on the left is going Nazi, is that I have to find like a Twitter source. Like I'm finding one person saying this, and I'm going to go try to say like everybody on the left is doing this. And, it's one of those things where the incentive is to get eyeballs there. You don't have the advertising you used to, and you don't have paper revenue, right? Like every day my dad used to buy the newspaper and bring it home.
Yeah. I have a whole little pre-written thing in my mind that I've never managed to use in anything. I'll work it into something someday. But like you hit the nail on the head there. It used to be that we had newspapers. That was where most journalism happened in this country. And they would make money by selling ad revenue,
right?
Like the classified ads. Like somebody wants to sell a used car, they put it in the newspaper. The newspaper gets a little money from them putting that ad. The local businesses do ads there, and the money from those ads was used to pay the salary of reporters. And reporters had time to actually research things and provide this wonderful service in which there was this fact-checked news sources to the community. And it didn't have to make money itself because the money was made by the ads. But the ad revenue is gone. Like the newspapers are entirely gone. But this is because of the internet, really. Craigslist was the thing that first killed it. But then, a million other things have ads. People just don't combine news consumption with those kinds of advertising anymore. And so the quote unquote news networks are desperate. They're like tasting desperation in a way they never used to. Not my whole life or the lives of several people before. We had this. If you go back far enough, you get to like yellow journalism.
Yeah.
You go back to like the founding fathers. They were actually like owning their own newspapers and talking bullshit about each other. So,
election of 1800. Yeah.
in a way, we're in a return to form now. In a way, we're back to where we started in America. But we had this pretty nice, stable era, a pretty long time in this country where you had newspapers that were, fairly neutral. There was an expectation of fairness because they didn't have to be exciting. They made money with the ads.
Right.
And that's all gone now. And it's that desperation to just get an audience, to just get attention and to make money has radically changed the way news functions.
Thank you so much for listening to part 1 of this special episode. In the next part, we'll delve deeper into the attention economy and its impact on social media, where Ben discusses how sharing sensational content online has become a lucrative business model that actually hurts our democracy. We'll also explore the prevalence of conspiracy theories and the psychological and social factors that fuel them. Please come back to enjoy more insightful conversations and thought-provoking discussions in the follow-up episode, which will be out shortly. I want to thank you for taking some time out of your day today and listening to the show. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to learn more about the topics discussed in this episode, check out our show notes at my website, jburkshow.podbean.com. And don't forget to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Good Pods, or wherever you enjoy your favorite podcast so you never miss out. You can also follow us at JBurk Show on Twitter and Instagram and JBurk17 on TikTok for the latest updates and going-ons behind the scenes. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review. It helps us improve and grow the show, and each and every one of you has such an impact on that, and I can't thank you enough. Join us next time, and remember,
it won't always be a straight line, but take the journey and escape a while for thoughtful excursions into the world of ideas across media, politics, technology, pop culture, and all realms of civic life.
You're listening to the With J. Burke Show.